Hello, my name is Benjamin Hart. I'm an American attorney and managing director of Integrity Legal here in Bangkok, Thailand. I'm making this video sort of in the immediate aftermath of the recent visit by the Secretary of State of the United States to the Kingdom of Thailand. And I wanted to go ahead and quote directly from the United States-Thailand communique on strategic alliance and partnership that was promulgated pretty much immediately or right after this recent visit, but quoting directly from that particular communique, quote, "As the United States and Thailand celebrate our 190th anniversary of diplomatic relations in 2023, we recognize 2 centuries of special trust and collaboration built through the 1833 Treaty of Amity and Commerce, our treaty alliance established through the 1954 Manila Pact, the 1962 Tanat Rus Communique, and the 1966 Treaty of Amity and Economic Relations. Forged by shared history and common values, and anchored by our collective commitment to build resilient, inclusive democracies and advance human rights, our 2 countries reaffirm our commitment to our strategic alliance as sovereign equals with steadfast commitment to the principles of mutual trust, mutual respect, and mutual interest." And I really enjoyed reading that when I read that the first time, because I can't tell you enough how much I love Thailand and the United States, if it's not immediately apparent. But the reason for this video, on top of that, I thought it was worthwhile to note somebody. I had read about this person some years ago. Some years ago. It was actually pre-COVID I read that book. It's actually a book called Chayo, King Vajiravut, and the Development of Thai Nationalism. That's King Rama VI. The book's called Chayo, King Vajiravut, and the Development of Thai Nationalism. I believe I actually checked that out from Nielsen Hayes Library in downtown Bangkok. Quite an interesting, insightful book. But something I've been reading about more recently in some other recent books was the history of the unequal treaties in the region, down here in Southeast Asia, as well as up in parts of China, etc., and sort of the history of colonialism, which, for Thailand was a very trying time, but Thailand, in my opinion, got through it with as much grace as any country could have, because Thailand managed to avoid being formally colonized. They avoided being colonized, although there was a lot of interaction between various colonial powers and Thailand, sometimes, not the most pleasant interaction, depending on the year and the circumstances and things. But Thailand held herself together and got through it, and it was a trying time. But few people, I think, really go back and look at the rather deep connections between Americans out this way and the history of Thailand, and sort of how the relationship evolved. Excuse me, I'm a little hoarse, so I'm drinking a little bit of hot water there. But the sort of the way the relationship evolved over time, just the general, really the relationship itself, the American-Thai relationship has just been, amity is the best way to describe it. It's just been a very amicable relationship all the way down the line. But I wanted to read a quick excerpt from, again, this book, Chayo, King Vajiravut, and the Development of Thai Nationalism, and I'll go ahead and put a link in the description below to this hawaiiopen.org, which actually has the book there where folks can actually read this excerpt. But quoting directly, "Despite the blandishments of the Siamese, little progress was made in treaty negotiations for some time." And just as a set-aside here, going back, the unequal treaties, especially what was called the Bowring Treaty, which the British kind of imposed on what was then called the Kingdom of Siam, now called Thailand, it was pretty unequal. Now, again, Thailand never surrendered sovereignty, but a lot of concessions were granted in Thailand for, in this case, British nationals, and then later there were similar agreements made between, French nationals. I think Germany had a treaty here. There were other colonial nations, nations in Europe that had colonial aspirations were out in this part of the world, and they made a number of treaties with Thailand that, to one degree or another, were pretty darn unequal. America, the United States, was not quite operating in that vein, well, at least by degree, not nearly to the extent of some other powers out here. But long story short, Thailand at the time, there were special advisors from foreign countries that were oftentimes brought in by the government here in Thailand to bring in foreign expertise and things and to advise on the situation, on how best to bring in certain industries, certain technologies. It's a very interesting time for Thailand, but at the same time, it's a very precarious time for Thailand. I just wanted to read this. So quoting again here, despite the blandishment of the Siamese, little progress was made in treaty negotiations for some time. Only two powers, Japan and France, seemed willing to follow the American lead, and the American lead being the sort of non-usage of these unequal treaties. That's what they're talking about here. Quoting further, by 1923, a new treaty on the American model, had been negotiated with Japan, and discussions with France along the same lines were well advanced. No progress at all, however, had been made with the British. The logjam was finally broken in 1924 with the appointment of Francis Bowes Sayre of the Harvard Law School as advisor in foreign affairs. Sayre took the Siamese case directly to the centers of power and decisions in Europe, and in a period of 9 months, succeeded in persuading the 10 European states with special rights in Siam to assent to new treaties. By August of 1925, he was able to cable King Wajiralongkorn that, quote, Siam's complete autonomy is now regained, unquote. And that was just, when I read that passage, just as an American and a Thai, I just enjoyed reading it. It kind of filled me with a level of pride, frankly, that, back then, America, kind of helped Thailand at a time when, frankly, I don't think the Thai side of me doesn't really like looking back on that era with a great deal of fondness, but this was kind of a moment of, sort of a, friends helping each other out, for, an era of amity. And I don't think that Mr. Sayre is oftentimes noted for his contributions, if you look him up, there's a lot of information about him in the context of his accomplishments as an American diplomat. But he also did a great deal of service to Thailand, then Siam, in providing, guidance and insight and assistance. And I think it's been good not only for Thailand just in a general sense, but for the Thai-American relationship to date.